Hey, good morning, ladies. So today we're talking again about immunity, and we're starting off today talking about, this week talking about prevention, because the thing about boosting your immunity is it's not just what herbs do I take or what supplements do I take or what can I take once I'm sick. It's all about kind of a multi-pronged or multi-level approach, and our first level is prevention. And when we talk about prevention, there's 3 levels. So primary prevention, that's the things that we're doing every single day to just create an environment within our bodies that is not conducive to illness, that will fight off bacteria or viruses when we are exposed to them, so that we have this robust functioning immune system. And that's things like eating a whole foods diet and incorporating those like nutrient dense foods that are going to help our bodies thrive. It's reducing the foods like the sugar that help or that lower our immune system when we eat them. And so the thing that we're going to talk about today seems super simple, but it's really, really important, which is part of primary prevention is hand washing, which sounds kind of silly to even have to say, but the thing about it is, I read this statistic and it's kind of disgusting, and I don't know who would admit to it or how they come up with it, but it is according to the CDC that only 35% of men and 65% of women wash their hands when they use a public restroom. Now, I don't know how they came up with that statistic, but it's out there. And so, but we've all seen it, so we know it happens. So it's kind of one of those things where I don't think it kind of sounds like a no-brainer, but we forget about it. So, and the reason hand washing is so important is we have microbes, which are maybe beneficial, maybe pathogenic. So there's microbes everywhere, right? And they're on every surface, everywhere we touch, all over our body, all inside of our body. And when we are talking about viruses, which are kind of the things that make us sick kind of in this cold and flu season, the cold, the flu, those are viruses. And they can remain viable on hard surfaces, so like doorknobs, light switches, sinks, handles, things that are touched a lot for several days, up to sometimes even with some of the stomach viruses, up to 40 days viable on surfaces. So when we're touching things, we're picking up those viruses or even bacteria on our hands, and then we touch our face, our mouth, our nose, and they get introduced into our body. Now, when our immune system is robust and healthy, it will generally fight those off. And when it's not, then that's when they get in and start to multiply and take over, and we get sick. Now, simple hand washing, right, prevents 1 in 3 diarrhea-related sicknesses and 1 in 5 respiratory infections like the cold and the flu. So we wash our hands, we've just reduced our risk of getting an infection by 1/3 or 1/5. So, I mean, that's pretty significant just by that one small thing. So we always want to make sure that we are washing our hands, right? And the way that we do this, so there's actually been studies about this, and we're not talking about hand sanitizer, we're talking about like straight soap and water. Has been shown to be no benefit for people outside of like the medical field to using antibacterial soaps. So just plain water, just plain soap is just as effective as using our antibacterial type soaps. In fact, using antibacterials actually contribute to antibiotic resistance. And the reason is every time we use antibiotics, either internally, on our skin, on our hands, is if it does not kill the bacteria, then those bacteria have the ability to become resistant to the antibiotics. And kind of a misconception is that, oh, I've never taken antibiotics, so I'm not antibiotic resistant. It's not based off of a person, it's based off just general antibiotic use. So a microbe becomes antibiotic resistant when it is not killed by the antibiotic. It can develop a resistance and then pass that trait on to other bacteria, not just its own bacteria, not just the same type of bacteria, even other types of bacteria. So now we have a bacteria that's resistant to the antibiotic, and it's passing that gene on to other ones. So now we've touched that one that's resistant, and that's how antibiotic resistance works. It's not based off of the individual, it's based off of the actual bacteria developing a resistance to the antibiotic and then passing the trait on to other bacteria. So back to the hand washing. We don't have to use antibacterials, we just have to use soap and water. They've actually, according to the CDC, there's no difference between hot water and cold water, and there's no difference between using an antibacterial soap and using a regular soap. You just have to actually perform the mechanism of washing your hands. And so what they recommend is at least 20 seconds, and it's actually the friction of the washing your hands that's going to detach and allow the water to rinse off the bacteria more than what type of soap you're using, what type of water you're using. It's running water and the friction. So that's one thing. And then when we're talking like antibacterials or hand sanitizers, because those are really popular, they're actually not, those hand sanitizers are not actually usually they're antibacterial. So if we're talking flu, virus, any type of cold, they're not effective against viruses if they're antibacterial. Now, that being said, we can create our own hand sanitizer or hand sanitizing spray. The CDC recommends something that's at least 60% alcohol, and then we could also add in some of our antiviral, antibacterial, antimicrobial essential oils to boost the effectiveness of our sprays. And you can add them into your soap too if you would like. I'm not saying that you can't, but there's just hasn't been any evidence that it's more effective than not using it. So you can go either way with the soap. You could do the spray. I'm going to do recipes for both of a handmade soap that you guys can do, or a handmade sanitizing spray. So those are going to come later today in another video. And then, the other part of this is just kind of as adults, it's maybe not as crucial, not that it's not crucial, but that we think about it. But if we teach our children these types of habits, then we're going to be setting them up for success to not get exposed to as many microbes and then not expose us. And then when our kids are sick, making sure that we do the same thing. Also, wiping down in our own homes those areas that are high traffic, that are going to get touched a lot by hands that have been, sneezed on and coughed on and whatever. So I'm going to post for you guys also a recipe for a cleaning spray that I also use. And then I'm just going to end today with kind of a little another fact, which I think is interesting, and it kind of shows this kind of importance of how simple but how crucial hand washing is. So throughout history, and they didn't know where microbes came from, or bacteria or viruses or any of that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until, and this is so recent that it's kind of mind-blowing, 1847, that someone said that, hey, maybe when it was actually an obstetrician, so he recognized this in childbirth, that, hey, maybe if we wash our hands before we deliver babies, that there'll be less infant and maternal death, because it was a really risky, a lot of people died during childbirth. And so he proposed this theory and he started implementing it in his own practice and saw that the mortality rates decreased greatly, and people thought he was crazy. He didn't do a study. He didn't provide any scientific evidence that washing your hands has any benefits, and people thought he was insane. But he noticed it in his own practice. It wasn't, and people actually insulted him for saying, "How dare you say that us not washing our hands is what's killing patients?" And then he goes on, it's another 20 years. So in 1865, someone else after Pasteur started doing kind of some of the germ theory stuff, that someone else that introduced it and started studying the fact that maybe hand washing is something that could prevent death and mortality and illness in patients. And still people were like, no, you're crazy. That is not true. We're not introducing these infections into our own patients. It's insane. and it was like 20 to 30 more years before people said, oh, maybe we should be washing our hands, which is just insane. So it was like this 50 to 60 year process before it took hold and people realized that there are bacteria and viruses and things that are infecting people or making them sick or causing infections, and that it became a practice where like doctors and physicians and surgeons actually washed their hands and started using chemicals to remove bacteria from like the air and their utensils and everything. So it was not until like the late 1800s, early 1900s that even became a practice, which is kind of crazy in history to think that that's like 100-year-old practice. But so I think that it's kind of one of those things that seems maybe a little silly to think about, like washing your hands being such a huge preventative measure, but at the same time, a lot of us don't think about the fact that it's actually that friction that we need to use. It's actually like the running water, the physical action of washing the hands that is more important than the products that we're using on our hands. And also the difference between not just going out and using a hand sanitizer, because that's not necessarily protecting us from the things that are, a lot of the bacteria has become resistant to antibacterials, and B, if it's a virus and you're using antibacterial, it's not doing anything for you. So it gives you this false sense of security that you're protecting yourself from the cold and the flu when you're using them, but it's not necessarily doing anything if you're not targeting the right type of microbe. And the kind of other little thing that I'll mention with even the hand sanitizers, even if you're making them yourself, they are not effective if your hands are already dirty. So if you have like dirt on your hands and you spray a hand sanitizer on it, it's not going to it's not going to get to the bacteria and the viruses and the microbes under the dirt. So if you're not using a relatively clean hand when you use the hand sanitizer of any kind either, it's not going to actually target and get to any of those microbes that are trapped by the dirt. You actually have to like slough them off to get the hand sanitizers to even be effective either. So that's another kind of caveat when using those hand sanitizers. Even if it's a homemade one, even if it's one that you've put a bunch of antimicrobials in it, your hands have to look relatively clean as well to have those even be effective. I guess that's it, you guys, pretty much for hand washing. If you guys have any questions, or you want to see any specific recipes, or you have any questions about what type of antimicrobials to use, feel free to post them in the Facebook group. If not, I'll be posting those recipes that I mentioned in the group. They will also be in the membership site, so be on the lookout for those. And any questions, like I said, ladies, post them in the group. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.